Welcome to the Chicago Booth Distinguished Speaker Series. In a few minutes, we'll get started, but first we wanted to let you know that all attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. However, we encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time via the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues with your audio, you might want to consider shutting down programs running in the background or dial in from your telephone. Our presentation will last for about 60 minutes today. Dean Rajan and Mr. DelBene will have a conversation, and then we should have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions from you. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll make sure that it is available to you via the Chicago Booth YouTube channel. On behalf of Chicago Booth, thank you for joining us. We know that you have several demands for your time and attention right now, and we truly appreciate your interest. With that, I will turn it over to Dean Rajan.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Good evening, everyone. As Jessica said, I'm Madhav Rajan. I'm the Dean and the George Schultz Professor of Accounting at Chicago Booth. I hope all of you are safe and well during this uncertain time, and it's great to see such a fantastic turnout today. It truly is my pleasure to have all of you here as we welcome Booth alumnus and Microsoft EVP Kurt DelBene to kick off our virtual Distinguished Speaker Series. The Speaker Series is a long-standing Chicago Booth tradition. It brings high-profile government, business, and community leaders to the school to share their insights and experience. And today we're doing this virtually, of course. So Kurt DelBene is Microsoft's Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy, Core Services Engineering, and Operations. Previously, he was with Microsoft as president of the Office Division, and he rejoined Microsoft in April 2015 after helping President Obama make improvements to healthcare.gov, the enrollment website for the Affordable Care Act, and after being a venture partner with the Majeure Venture Group. So Kurt joined Microsoft in '92. Before that, he was a management consultant with McKinsey, working on business strategy for technology companies. And prior to that, he worked as a software developer and systems engineer for AT&T Bell Labs. Kurt holds a Bachelor of Industrial Engineering from the University of Arizona, an MS from Stanford, and an MBA from Chicago Booth. We're thrilled to have Kurt here today to speak to us about Microsoft's response to COVID-19. Thank you for being here, Kurt.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe we could begin by having you sketch the scope of your responsibilities broadly at Microsoft. And
Sure.
Within that, where does the COVID response come in?
So as you said, I lead two functions at Microsoft. I lead our corporate strategy team and also an organization we call Core Services Engineering and Operations. And on that second half, I lead our internal systems development, so all of our internal software that does, all of our transactioning, and also our actual operations. So the piece that if you sign an enterprise agreement for us, for instance, that goes through a regional operating center. It might be anywhere around the world. And another part of that function actually is our crisis management team is in that organization. And so as part of that, I ended up becoming the crisis management lead on our COVID response. Not something I kind of thought it was part of the job, but it's been super consuming for the past several months.
So going back, when and how did Microsoft realize that there was a threat posed by the pandemic, and how did you think about starting to respond to that?
Yeah, so we have a pretty large presence in Asia, in particular in China. And so the first time we started seeing it was when it hit in Wuhan and in China. We got reports very early on that it was becoming an issue. And we started tracking. What we tend to do is we invoke the crisis management team. We'd actually done a bunch of tabletop exercises with a leadership team. This was actually the first one where we actually took that process and made it real. So it was actually gratifying that we actually had that in place. But so we started tracking it and figuring out what our folks in Asia needed and in China in particular. But when it started spreading, that's when the point where we started communicating very intensively with employees. We had a playbook as to what we needed to do, both in terms of monitoring what the situation was with the virus, how we needed to respond internally, and really started meeting as an SLT once a week, then once a day actually, to walk through, what's the status, where do we see it going, and really what do we need to do, what do we need to put in place to really get it, get our response in order, and really make sure that all of our employees were safe and that we were being proactive in responding to the crisis. And so what that amounted to for us was, one, tracking where it was going in terms of all of our different locations, getting information about what was going on with individual cases, because then you start seeing people showing up in your various buildings with the virus, and how do you respond to that? Figuring out what our contingency plans were for if it got bad enough, how we would actually get out of the buildings. And we successively tracked it across the world and kind of, one, ramped up our guidance over time. We also had to change what our support was for employees. In particular, as everybody was going for home, schools stopped being in session. We monitored what their reactions were. We communicated with them multiple times a week. I actually send the all company emails sent into like 150,000 people saying, this is what's going on, this is what you can expect from us, and encouraging them to send me an email back if they had any questions. So I was in this triage mode of, getting in hundreds of emails and with particular questions where people wanted to know what's their particular situation. So we got in that rhythm. We also mobilized, it's very much a whole Microsoft effort. We had folks that are working on our external response. Brad Smith, our president and chief legal counsel, he kind of focused on that piece of it with his team. We engaged with industry and with academics to figure out how can we help in fighting the virus. We engaged with our local community and figured out how can we actually help. It turns out that we have access to supplies, to PPE that they don't have access to. And so we were able to get a bunch of those and actually give them to local health professionals and hospitals, et cetera. So really taking every stage of it and every aspect of it and really integrating it into a response overall. So really got into a rhythm and went from there.
So if you look back, what systems did you have in place that you thought ended up being the most useful as you went through this transition? And what are the big challenges that you had to face going through this?
Well, the amazing thing is that the crisis management process that we had actually designed worked pretty well. And so we have a centralized crisis management team, then we have area teams in each of the geographies that Microsoft works on, and then we have local crisis management teams as well. And we invoked that for the first time, and it actually worked quite well. So the preparation that we've done there really did work well. And if other organizations don't have that, that's really the key. The other thing is we took 150,000 people and had them work remotely, had them work from home. And so we had to gear up Teams, the use of Teams, Microsoft Teams, our collaboration video conferencing where has just exploded. And it actually worked quite well for us as well. So everything became a virtual meeting, like the meeting that we've got here. We had to supply people with virtual private networking access back into campus. That worked well. The system of actually getting into a dialogue with employees on a regular basis, hearing their feedback, and then actually adapting our guidance based on what we heard, whether it's an HR guidance as students were home and people had to figure out what are we going to do as far as daycare is concerned. Every aspect of it, getting into that sympathetic rhythm with folks really, really worked very well. And the other thing is just the ability to work at home was really great. We actually track what we call pull requests, which are software developers request for somebody else to review their code to check it in. And pull requests actually went up about 15% when our developers started working at home. So we actually saw an increase in productivity as people didn't have to commute into the office, and it's really kind of remarkable. So that was a piece that worked really well. And then the other thing is we actually had to do all of our business and transactioning from home. And so as I said, I run our operations team. We actually had to do all of our processing of enterprise agreements remotely for the very first time. And that actually shockingly went without a hiccup, and we're super thankful for that. So that whole set of processes that we've done kind of disaster planning for actually worked quite well.
So you mentioned that you were doing daily meetings, and I presume you're not anymore. What rhythm are you in now, and what decisions are you making sort of looking ahead?
We're 3 times a week now. And so we have 2 meetings that are just COVID. And then we have an SLT, or what we call our senior leadership team meeting, every week for about 5 to 6 hours a week. And we cover COVID in that as well. So we're meeting effectively 3 times a week. But we also are in a situation where we would bring everybody together at any time. And everybody in the SLT knows that as well. And then the rhythm that I have with employees now is I communicate with them once a week, usually on Monday evenings. And so I get a draft of the email from the folks who pull it together, and I mull over it for a couple hours, trying to get it into the voice that I feel good about, and then I send it out, usually about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and then I've got 100 emails at least when I wake up in the morning. So we've gotten into a pretty good rhythm, but now we've changed, and now we're all focused on what is the planning for going back into the office, and employees want to know. What's happening with the virus worldwide? So we talk about the R values of the virus in all geographies we're in. We talk about how we're developing the process for them coming back. We stress that we're actually not going to be the first people to come back. They talk about flattening the curve, and information workers in particular ought to be the people that come back later, because there are essential workers, and we've had essential workers that have been working, in our data centers forever since this started, and thankfully they are. Basically, we run a lot of essential infrastructure for the government, for schools, et cetera, and they've just got to keep our data centers running. But then what'll happen is it'll slowly ratchet up the sets of people that'll come back, and we're going to make it all voluntary for a long period of time. I just communicated on Monday night that at least through October, it will be voluntary for people to feel like they can come back into the office. And so we'll be in this kind of sliding scale, looking at what's happening in terms of local guidance, looking at what's happening to the virus, and we talk about it as turning a dial. How far do we want to turn the dial and how quickly to get back? So that's been kind of what we're focused on now.
So looking at the customer side, what are your customers looking for from you at this time? And what are sort of the new business needs that you're seeing from their standpoint?
Yeah, it's been obviously quite a response on their part as well. And they're all kind of reacting in real time. I think the first thing we've seen is that, as I said, Teams has really exploded. We've actually done quite well ahead of this of selling Teams, the product, into all of our core customers, but this has caused a very fast response to actually deploy that. So we've seen, it's gone up, I think, from 20 or 30 million, what we call DAO or daily active users, to over 75 million now. And so it's been an explosion just in use there, and that's gone quite well. It's actually consumed a lot of data center capacity. So we've been figuring out, how do we take the excess capacity we have in our worldwide data centers, and how much of it can we dedicate to Teams? How much of it can we dedicate to Azure use as well? Because the other thing we're seeing with customers is that need to put in new systems right now to deal with the crisis, and they're putting in cloud systems, obviously. And also, it's actually accelerating people's movement to the cloud, because you've got a bunch of developers. You got what project are you going to put them on? It ought to be a project you work on from home. And a lot of those cases, those are cloud-based projects. So we've seen kind of an explosion in Azure usage as well. But I would say, if you want to look at the industry view of it, the response of industry has been different by industry. If you look at automotive, you look at manufacturing, it's all about, how do I build better supply chain resiliency? How do I automate my supply chain left to right so that I don't get in this situation where I don't have supplies moving forward? If you look at hospitality, it's really about, how do I respond to the decrease in demand? How do I prepare as it comes back moving forward? Healthcare has been a huge place where we've both consulted in terms of response to the virus, in terms of vaccine development and understanding the virus. But also, we built a bot that helps. It's on the CDC website and over 1,000 websites worldwide now, helping people diagnose what's going on with whether they have coronavirus or not, and focusing them to the right place. But we're seeing a massive transformation in healthcare. It's kind of like digital transformation, as Satya said in our earnings. He said it's all happening in 2 years of transformation happening in 2 months. And it's hitting each one of those industries, some of them more than others. As I said, healthcare, every single aspect, all the P's, so to speak, is what they talk about, patients, providers, payers, platform, all the way down the stack. It's been a massive transformation, all of it kind of driven by digitization, which is kind of on a tear right now.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the businesses that you work with, were any of them sort of better prepared, you think, than others for dealing with something like this? And sort of more broadly, in terms of transformation, which ones do you think are going to get transformed the most sort of going forward?
I think each one, the level of preparedness varied. I think we've got some, it's really interesting to see. We've got some that have been like us where they've said, yes, we had a plan in place, we've executed the plan. Others have responded super quickly. And then others have just like, it's a lot of this is talking to your peers. One of the things that's been gratifying is I think in every industry, peer groups have come together, peer groups of companies saying this is something where we kind of have to get beyond the competition we have and how do we share best practices. We talk to Amazon, we talk to Google, Facebook. We say, what are you doing? What are you doing? And that's actually been super gratifying. So I think there's a variable degree to which people were prepared, but they're responding super quickly along the way. I think every one of them is trying to figure out how do they take care of their employees? How do they deliver services to customers? How do they think about the transformation of their business? I talked a little bit about healthcare, but retail is the same way. We get a lot of discussions from the retailers about, curbside pickup is now going to be the big thing. So how do I build a system that helps me to do curbside pickup effectively? In every industry, there's some response they're doing. They're trying to preserve their existing business. And then they're, as I said, kind of digital transformation happening in 2 months that should have taken 2 years or would have taken 2 years otherwise.
So you were recruited by the Obama administration to come back, rescue the development of the platform, the digital platform, healthcare.gov. Not that that's a sort of a good segue into this, but in general, if you were to think about the US response to the pandemic, sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a lot written on this. So I don't know that I'm that particularly person at the forefront of understanding. There are a few things I think are probably fairly incontrovertible. I think overall, and Bill Gates kind of pointed this out to everybody, and it's kind of, I love the fact he said, it's like, this is an area where I didn't want to be right. But he pointed out in a number of his publications saying, if a virus like this hits us, we are ill prepared for that. And I think we're seeing that's the case. If you look at, what the strategic reserves looked like, there were a lot of ventilators there that didn't actually work very well. There wasn't as much capacity that existed there. That's just a fact that is, we were not as prepared in that regard as well. The ability to ramp up testing as well, in any administration, I think that would have been difficult. I think we had some missteps along the way that, didn't get us out there with all the necessary supplies and the testing, and we kind of centralized it when maybe we shouldn't have. So regardless of the particular politics that you see, I think the kind of incontrovertible truth is that we were not as prepared as we would have liked to have been. And I think we're going to see that moving forward, we will be, and we'll know that something like this will happen. I don't think it's very debatable that this is going to be one of the defining moments for our generation. Sort of like for my grandparents, it was the Depression. This one is going to be it for us. And it is going to fundamentally change how we operate moving forward. I think we're even figuring out what does it mean for us moving forward as a company in how we work. We're finding we're very productive now working, away from home. And we also are finding if you want to enforce social distancing, we do not have as much capacity in our offices as we had in the past. And we're going to be off like probably 20% or so on our capacity. We're going to lose something like 7,000 seats just in the Puget Sound area. So we've got to figure out how we're going to work differently, not just now, but in the future. And so things like, in the past, it was like we're a culture where it was about being at work. And software development is a team sport. Everybody comes around, they have the daily stand-up, et cetera. It was the norm where most people were in a conference room and there were a few people online. What's it going to look like when most people are going to be online and a few people or none are going to be in the conference room? Mm-hmm. So we think this is fundamentally going to change, how we are as a society moving forward. But again, getting back to your original question, I think, setting aside the debate of how we're responding right now, I think we could have been more prepared, and I think we will be in the future.
I think you mentioned a little bit. Could you say a little bit more about sort of new tools that you're thinking about or developing for the private sector, but also for the public sector, sort of going forward?
Yeah, so I think first, we're seeing this explosion in terms of tools like we're using here, Wish it had been in Teams, but Zoom I attend a lot of Zoom meetings too. And so that actually is going to be, I think, at the heart of how people work moving forward. I think the idea of having team spaces where all of the collaboration is going on right there, having an application environment that's on top of that. So for instance, why can't I do all of my approvals of all the business contracts, all the expense reports right from a contextual space where it all kind of slots in? I click on one of them and up pops a workflow there. I think that's going to be the standard way that people work as well. We're seeing a lot of solutions coming in where people want, they want a new supply chain solution. They want to be end-to-end, all of it in the cloud. I think that will become the norm, that everything being cloud-based in a hybrid world, because there's always some compute that needs to go on premises. I think that's going to be the norm as well. One of the interesting things is public health has been fundamentally transformed, and it is transforming. So if you think about it, this is really showing the essential nature of data in a public health response. We look worldwide at what the outbreaks are. Everybody is, glued to their browser or TV to say what's the outbreak and what's the curve look in any location. The intensity of data in the public health sector will change over time. There's a lot of debate around, should I have a tracking app so that two people coming close to me, they can see, if I get the virus, I can tell everybody, who was I in contact with? That's a data intensive application, and that it's going to amplify that data being intrinsic into how we operate. But it also brings in interesting questions around privacy. And we've done a blog where we're basically saying, if you're going to have a tracking application, here are the criteria that have to be met in order to keep people's information private and safe. And so, I think a lot of solutions in the here and now, we get a lot of solutions around how do I track what's happening with my employees in terms of their health, a lot of very specific ones. But I think fundamentally what we're going to see is much more connected online collaboration and working remotely, and an intensification and an acceleration of the migration to the cloud.
So given the experience you've had with this and everything else, and you've seen the global response to the crisis, are there things that make you sort of either pessimistic or optimistic about where the world's economies are heading for the remainder of this year and even beyond that?
Yeah. Well, I think in the near term, we're seeing the impact. I mean, if you look at the Journal had an article, I think last week, that in the Eurozone countries, the last quarter is down like 4% and projected to be at 14% for the overall year. I think we're obviously seeing a depression in the near term. Our results were quite good, although you have to see that kind of cascading through to our customers and what that does to demand overall. I think it's going to be one of those things that's a shorter term shock and come back. I think the unfortunate thing, as everybody knows, is the impact in terms of workers and being out of work for that period of time. It disproportionately hits them. I like the fact that Congress is basically saying this is the time to put in place programs to actually kind of buffer that. But it's, that demand is almost infinite. How much can you do? My wife is member of Congress, and she'll be going back to vote on another one of these packages. And we'll continue to have those. And thank heavens we are in that position where everybody on a bipartisan basis says there is something we can do in the near term. Now we're going to have to figure out what the impact of that is in the long run. And, I have confidence that people will do that, but it's really in that kind of unknown zone, I think, at this point. I think we're going to see a depression in things, but I kind of am hopeful that it'll come back pretty quickly.
And just building on that, for the students who are online today, the graduating students in particular, do you see this as having changed the hiring needs in tech or other industries that you've had some experience with?
Obviously we're seeing a depression in hiring in particular areas. I think if you took Microsoft as any gauge, we are always looking, and even now looking for talented people. And for folks like Chicago grads, which are at the top of the rung of capabilities, you guys do a great job. I'm still thankful for the education that I got here or at Chicago. I think there's always going to be opportunities there. I think if you ever thought about, there's always this question of do what you love and everything else will follow. And so I guess I would say do what you love and see if the situation in terms of the job market changes, what that looks like. But life is long. It might depress things in the long term. I think with the talented folks that Chicago has, there'll always be those opportunities. And that's how we're looking at it as well. We have not said we're in a hiring freeze. We have, in my team in particular, we triage what roles we're going to continue to fill versus which ones are kind of optional right now and we'll hold off on filling. But as a result of that, that gives us a consistent flow of people that we're still trying to hire. And I think that's true across Microsoft. It's certainly true about tech. I think tech overall will only do better as a result of this move. It if you look at the response to the virus and the pandemic, it has been tech focused in a lot of ways. I think healthcare, I think, some of the development in terms of vaccines and biology is fascinating. That's going to be a fantastic area moving forward. Just lots of opportunities. It might change a little bit, but still a lot of opportunities in the future.
So you've been through many different leadership roles in different settings, various complexities. If you could go back to one of the points you were talking about, how did your education at Chicago, at Booth, help you, prepare you for that? I think our students would love to hear that.
Well, I will say I had a fantastic time at University of Chicago, and it wasn't just going to Harold's Fried Chicken Shack, although that was a high point as well. I would say that the thing that has been two things. One, the notion of, I have to say in terms of my personal finances, diversification, I've always appreciated that. I think you guys were right, although Microsoft stock, I might have done better if I didn't appreciate or diversify quite so much, but I still believe in the efficient markets by and large, and that's been helpful. I would say the ability to slice and dice a problem into what does the industry structure look like? How is it fundamentally going to change or not change? And, we get a lot of people, and tech I think is like this overall, where you get a lot of people who are just saying, I've got a great idea. I know this is a fantastic idea. Let me just push it through. If you're an engineer and that is your focus point, you can get overly excited about that. If you're an engineer or another business-oriented person and you have that rigor around being able to analyze what are competitors going to do, what direction is the industry heading, what direction is society heading, what are customer demands look like, and from there analyze what you think, what's a good idea versus a bad idea. That I think is the secret sauce that Chicago taught me. I love the analytics it gave me. I still joke to people that I got a calculus question on my HR final, which I don't think there's any place else I would have gotten that. I was pretty pumped because I noticed it was it was a calculus problem, and I said, I got this one. But it's a fantastic education, and I really do think it prepares you super well.
Thank you. So I'm going to see if we have any questions from the audience, because I see some popping up. Jessica?
Sure. How well was the national response framework tied to the crisis response and even the tabletop exercises?
That's a really good question. So let me take that from a couple of angles, and I should have talked through this as well as part of our response. As we thought about our response, we were super principle based, and so we started very early on to say, first and foremost, that we will be principle based. We will analyze things against a rational framework of what the right thing is to do. We then said, one, local healthcare guidance is critical, and that'll be the foundation of how we think about things. What are professionals thinking about? What are they recommending? What is local guidance? What is national guidance? It's been a little tricky to decipher national guidance. So for instance, when the administration comes out and says, and early on they did this, of saying, they would say something about the virus as to whether you should be working from home, whether you should not. And it wasn't actually saying that this is what you should do. It was more of a point of view. But in local guidance, they actually said, we recommend X. Now and so by and large, that was the foundation of saying, we will go with local guidance to the extent that it made sense. In most cases, it does. We had a public health expert in our V team, our virtual team that goes across HR, legal, operations, et cetera. And we'll be principle based. So for instance, safety of our employees is first. Second, we think about in terms of how do we help our customers be better. We think about our movement, another one that I already said, our movement back into the workplace will be voluntary. So we set these set of principles and we drove to that. Now, the tabletop exercises, they are really helpful because you coordinate and you get into this notion of, we have a notion of swim lanes where, you know, the legal folks know that their boundaries are this, they can have an opinion elsewhere, but they know that these are the areas that they're supposed to focus on. And one of the things that worked really, really well that the tabletop exercise kind of helps us with is for people to understand where they're supposed to focus, how we collaborate and say, hey, I hear what you're doing over there, and I think it's actually a little bit different. But in the end, defer and say, this is, you know, I defer to you as the expert. Satya was actually pretty good about that too. Sometimes he defers and sometimes he says, you know, I'm the person who's ultimately responsible. I'm actually going to say what the right answer is here or what I think we should be doing here. And I think the preparation has been really, really good in that regard. But again, it's first and foremost, go with public guidance, figure out what it means for us as well. It's also interesting, we actually have cases, and you're seeing this around the world, where economies are coming back and local officials are saying, you should come back to work. And we're saying, not yet. And there we're seeing the fact that those officials are saying that to bring the economy back, but we're not quite comfortable yet with whether it's time to go back. So there's always this combination of taking all the data, figuring out what it means for you, and then taking the courses from there.
What sort of discussions is Microsoft having with its customers with respect to force majeure in existing contracts? And are there any lessons learned in this regard?
You mean force, I'm not exactly sure what they're referring to in terms of force majeure in their particular situation. I don't believe we do have a lot of cases where people are saying because of the particular circumstances that we're in, that a contract with Microsoft would be subject to force majeure. I think it is a big issue in places like the retail industry, but I'm not an expert in that area. I will say that there's never been a time, and I think this is substantiated and logical anyhow, is there's never been a time when the things that Microsoft provides are more critical. And so the whole collaboration suite, we talked about Teams, talked about the movement of more folks to the cloud. These are just natural things that are happening as a result of the pandemic. And so I don't think we get into those situations very often. We may get into a situation about, you know, what's the timing for closing a contract, but I don't think otherwise it's been a particular issue for us with our business in specific.
What do you think will be the main systemic changes in Microsoft's business going forward?
Well, there's a number, part of the corporate strategy team, one of the efforts they did is figure out what are the trends that are episodic and what are the trends that we think are going to happen for a long period of time and to fundamentally change the business. Some of the ones that we think are sustained, remote work is sustained. We think it gets amplified. We already talked a bit about that. We think e-learning is a fundamental change that is only going to amplify as well. I think we're pretty well positioned with LinkedIn in particular and our offerings around Office 365 for learning. But, you know, I'm on the board of Reed College, and right now Reed is trying to figure out what next year looks like and whether they can actually bring people into the classroom or not. And what does a distance learning platform look like? So I think the learning both integrated into your job and as part of, you know, a degree is going to fundamentally change as well. I think e-commerce is going to only amplify over a period of time. I think it's going to drive quicker response from brick and mortar retailers into the future. And so there's an opportunity for us to provide those. We're big in that space. There's an opportunity for us to provide those solutions. This is a time when gaming actually has been huge. You know, people are at home more and kids are at home more. And so the gaming business for us is doing fantastically. We also see a big opportunity in digital health and wellness. And so, it's people tend to focus more around what the patient experience is or what the provider experience is. I think we see it as a stack all the way from the top to the bottom, all those 6 Ps, as I said. And we're going to have to make a decision about some of them are going to be amplified, like the transformation towards telemedicine is going to be a big thing. But in other places, some areas of transformation may actually happen more slowly as demand, inpatient demand for physicians is actually down potentially 30% right now. And so I think we have to think holistically across that entire solution space. Certainly medical advances and the digital analysis required to do those, that's going to be an explosion right now. It's interesting, a ton of the folks that we're working on cancer, in the future, they're all going to be, at least in the near future, a ton of them are working on virus analysis and that whole space in medicine. What are the implications of that? What gets escalated more quickly in terms of fields of medicine and what slows? And so we're thinking through all those different things.
I understand Microsoft works with some Formula One teams and that you have an interest in racing in Formula One cars. Do you think we might see Formula One races again? And what's Microsoft's role in Formula One in the future?
It's a good question. I think Formula One in particular was heavily impacted. It started in Australia when one of the teams, I think the McLaren team, had a few people come down with being diagnosed with coronavirus. And then it has successively, this is an interesting one, I guess maybe it's just because I'm interested in the field. I race old Formula One cars. But it's successively cascaded through and you saw all of the different pieces or all of the different events got canceled. And they're looking into the future. The question is, we were talking before this call started, is there going to be an NFL season? Well, they're certainly debating whether there's going to be a Formula One season moving forward. The interesting thing for Formula One in particular was this was going to be a year of a massive change in the formula. And it was around, it was a very expensive thing. So they've actually decided to postpone that for a year. I think if you were to ask some of those folks, they would say this whole cost of the big Formula One teams like Ferrari and Mercedes and Red Bull, it costs just an incredible amount of money for those folks to field a team every year. And they've always been working to kind of balance the playing field for some of the new entrant teams. And I think it will probably increase the demand to actually change the equation in the future because they feel like the economy is not going to be as good and we're going to have trouble getting people out. Now, the fortunate thing about the F1 industry is that it is a big TV market. And so I think, and again, we were talking about this before we came on, are you going to have games that are projected or that are broadcast without anybody in the stands? And it may actually be. But everything's going to, it's all going to, I think it'll come back, but it'll just be time before it gets there.
What is your view on the stock market marginally rising while the labor market is shaky? Stores close, gas prices tanking, and similar dips that we've evidently seen.
Well, now you're talking about me as an opinion as opposed to an expert. There are better people on this call that can answer this question. I'll tell you, Kurt's opinion is that, it's always that old phrase that in the near term, the stock market is a voting machine, and in the long term, the stock market is a weighing machine. And I think that's kind of true in this case too. So I think, at least as I see it, people are looking and seeing that the market will come back and that the underlying economy will come back. And they're making those votes right now as to what industries will do well in that transformation and which ones will be more challenged. And so I think you saw in hospitality and energy and some of the manufacturing, I think you saw a pretty significant sell-off. Then you have the natural thing of people seeing an opportunity and a buying opportunity. And so that starts to come back a little bit. Kurt's personal opinion is it's been a pretty heady return, and it is a little disconnected from, the economy is going to be challenged for a while, but gratified to see that people are betting that this thing is going to be behind us at some point. But again, I say I am not a stock market expert.
Do you think we've taken the right approach to the deal to deal with this crisis, or should we have left the economy open and let the disease run its course?
I get this question a lot from employees. They essentially see what happens to the economy and say, is it out of proportion with what's happening? And I get a lot, I can't tell you the number of emails I get of saying, you know, and they will send me to the local professor who, I think one of the interesting one was a study of 3,000 people in San Mateo that showed that the fraction of people who have, and I think it was a Stanford professor who did this, said that if you extrapolate from this 3,000 people that I recruited from an ad on Facebook and found out the prevalence of virus among those people, then it's 50 to 80 million more people, roughly speaking, than we think have it. And so it's all behind us. And, you know, I think you have to think about this as there's a difference between the decision you make and the outcome. And I think what we're doing now is a good decision given the uncertainty that we're working on from. And we're going to see what the outcome looks like. And it could be a case of good decision, good outcome, good decision, bad outcome because the economy does poorly. But I think either way, the decision we're making right now to focus on saving people's lives is the right one. We will never know. And the people who criticize this, you know, the actions being taken, they're not the ones actually having to make this decision. If anything else, I've got incredible respect for the people in government that are actually having to make these decisions because they're not making them in the absence of seeing the impact that will happen by virtue of their actions. And I see the same thing. I can't tell you how much time we spend ruminating about, like, when will we exit our buildings? And we have the same issue when we're coming back. And so you have to, it's a very difficult position to be in. They're very difficult decisions. I feel generally being cautious and coming back when the data suggests we come back is the right move, and coming back safely. We've really got to do a great job practicing social distancing and triaging and tracing folks that come and are diagnosed as positive. And it's taking us some time to get everything in place, all the PPE in place. So generally speaking, the short answer would be, I do believe that the cautious approach is the right one.
How are you handling the massive growth in cloud and Azure's usage for emerging markets like Middle East Africa?
We've actually been pretty good position in terms of, we have been on the forefront of understanding that the movement to the cloud has been, is going to be a global one. And so we've put data centers, Africa has been a place where we're putting in development centers. And we've got a development center that we're building in Nigeria. We've got another one in Kenya. We've got data centers in Africa. We have a presence that's already worldwide. And we made that investment very early on. The thing I think we see needing to respond to is where that demand comes in what order. And how much of it comes in developed markets versus how much of it comes in developing markets. We also had to do things like, we stood up a multi-million user tenant for Office 365. Tenant is an organization, if you will, of Office 365 for the federal government and for the DoD, Department of Defense. And so we were making real-time decisions all the time about where we need to allocate capacity. Fortunately, we were in a pretty good position, although it's been overwhelming demand, of being pretty well laid out across the world in terms of how much capacity we have. But the product teams have been in a constant motion of triaging, how much do I dedicate to Teams? How much do I dedicate to Azure? Where is that demand going to surface? The other thing is, by being a global network, essentially, you get into a position where you can actually host people on particular regions that might be a little bit further away from where their actual headquarters are, and it works out just fine. So just kind of constantly triaging, and so far so good.
I combine a couple of questions here about gaming. How do you project COVID impacts your gaming business? And then kind of related to that, both Microsoft and Sony are to launch next generation consoles this holiday season. What's Microsoft doing strategically to win this upcoming console war, unlike the previous one?
Great questions. It is a very good market for gaming right now, as I kind of talked about before. What we're seeing, there's a couple of themes that are going on in gaming. The first thing is this movement towards subscriptions and people saying, I want to pay a certain amount a month and I want to buy everything in your portfolio and be able to access that whenever I want to on a particular game. And we're seeing that movement happen pretty strongly. Game Pass in particular, which is our offering as a subscription, is doing very well. And so that, I think that trend will continue. That trend is cross-platform. And so console, PC, mobile devices, well, that is what gaming looks like moving forward. And we're pretty well positioned there. We probably have the largest, I'm sure we have the largest kind of inventory of high quality games across all those platforms. And so that's a good thing. And having that backed by a subscription is kind of the secret sauce moving forward. And then the third thing that kind of that's happening that's really critical is streaming for gaming. And we have our offering in terms of a cloud-based streaming offering. And what that does really is we take our console and we host it in a data center. And you stream that game in real time on any device that you want to stream that on. And so that actually gets into your point about what's the importance of a console. Well, it is still a fundamentally console-driven market, but it's changing. And so we made the bet, Sony made the bet as well, that a next generation console is still absolutely critical. And we feel very good about the one that's coming out later on this year. As being, on the forefront of what a gaming console ought to be, and that the kinds of games that will be played on there are just going to be world class. But it is always it's drive it forward towards subscription, get the balance of what platform you're on right, and bet on the future in terms of the next generation console, bet on the future in terms of streaming as the ultimate way that people are going to consume that content.
What leadership style and approach do you take with your team, and has your experience at Booth impacted that at all?
That's a good question. I'm reflecting in the second half of how Booth might have impacted, but there's a couple of things I think that define how I engage with the team. First, I tend to be, having been an engineer, I tend to be deeply involved technically with the team. I feel as if I need to understand the details very deeply so that I can understand whether things are on track or not, as opposed to just depending upon what folks are telling me. That changes the very nature of the discussion that I have with my teams, because I did a service 90-minute service review just this morning, where we walked through all the metrics that define how we're doing in terms of our services, how we're doing in terms of delivering operations and services to business operations to our customers. And I get very deeply involved in those discussions. So I think I try to lead by example. I think I tend to try to be an empathetic leader. And I grew up, my mother was a therapist growing up. And so I tend to kind of try to understand what makes somebody tick and try to engage with them in an understanding way, and really get a dialogue going between the people in my team and myself. And I think that that changes fundamentally. You can't be this person that just leads from the top. I think I love the notion of servant leadership. I think that's a really important concept, to be that person that's saying, part of the core of my job is to make you successful, to make our business successful. And I think that is the core of what I do. Now, what Chicago did to help me there, I'm not sure. I was more of a finance guy than I was on the management train. So I'm not sure I took as many of management courses there. We've already talked about the analytic rigor that I got here. And I think that's, that ability to drill deeply, to understand the business model very fundamentally and understand whether I believe it. Those are certainly things that guide the way I lead.
What's the biggest risk you see for a company like Microsoft?
The risk for Microsoft is the nature of the business that we're in. There is no, I won't say there aren't any other businesses quite as harrowing as the tech business, but if I just look at the 27 years plus that I spent at Microsoft, we have fundamentally changed every dollar that comes in there, and it can happen in 18 months. And so the risks that Microsoft faces, we probably don't even know what they are. we spend a lot of times, we have a framework where a horizons framework, and I'm sure we're not alone in doing this, but we look of our investments in terms of 3 horizons. We think of it in the here and now of how we sustain our existing business. We think of that, and that's horizon 1. Horizon 2 is the businesses that are going to replace the existing businesses as the new drivers of growth in the future. And then the third one is the ones that are out there that we think are the fundamental drivers of transformation in our business moving forward. And so those are things like quantum computing. You know, we have a very big investment in quantum computing. We're very bullish about it, but it is still an unproven science. And yet, if and when quantum gets proven, the fundamental algorithms of encryption are no longer valid. And that is a massive transformation that we need to be in the front foot on. We need to think about, you know, this massive footprint we have in data centers around the world. How does it change what you put in those data centers? How does it change the compute distribution between local compute and cloud compute when, you know, you're getting orders of magnitude increase in terms of the compute capabilities? And how does it change things like encryption? And so, I mean, to net it out, with the things that the fundamental risks for our business are being behind the curve on the next thing that's going to happen. And the second thing is risking the relationship that we have with customers today. We've been through, in Microsoft, we've been through a transformation of, you know, a lot has been written about the old Microsoft, which was, you know, we're a monopoly in the operating system and we don't care and all that sort of thing. I knew those memes from before. We are now fundamentally a much more customer-centric company. We live and die based on the computing that is expressed by the company and by our customers in real time. And so if we ever break that trust with customers, then, you know, as much as the future can be, we can mess up our future by not getting the right Horizon 3 thing, we can mess up the here and now by doing something wrong and breaking the trust that we have with customers, and it can all go sideways. But net, this is a business that you never go into the office and say, everything's guaranteed. I can kick back, put my feet up, and all the dollars and the success are going to keep coming.
A couple of questions that were here about being productive. So someone asks, you know, can you give us a couple of tips on how best to keep productive? And what are your any of your tips that you might have on keeping balance between work and life?
Yeah, good question. We've actually published a bunch of, we get this question a lot. What does it look like working from home and how do you remain productive? I would say as much as we definitely, and I'd encourage you to go to our website and you can actually see, we put together a PowerPoint slide, not surprising, it's PowerPoint. But it basically walks through, here's our tips and tricks for how you continue to be productive, how you can be most productive working from home, at least from Microsoft's perspective. I think the one I would emphasize is you got to get away from it as well. I actually, you know, I roll out of bed about 5:15 and I'm immediately at my PC. There's no commute anymore. And the days are stacked one after another. I literally leave one meeting, and I'm not alone in this. I leave one meeting and go right into the next one. And then at, you know, if it's Monday night at 5:30 or 6, I get the mail that I need to send that evening. And as I said, it takes me 2 or 3 hours to get it into a place that I'm happy with it. And then I send, and that's the end of the day. You've got to figure out ways to take breaks in there. I don't know whether you saw my dog walking by, but his expectations of getting walks has increased, and I try to find some time for that as well. My assistant tries to schedule that time in. I think, yeah, we've also really emphasized you have to reach out to coworkers and make it human and really make that connection that you used to have in the office. Just reach out. And I reached out in one of my, we did a little video with Phil Spencer, who leads our gaming division. And I reached out to him and just did a check-in, and we filmed it and put it up, linked to it on my mail. So how do you still have those social interactions, since we're social animals? One of the things Phil does, which I really like, is at 6 o'clock, he shuts the door to his office and he actually changes clothing to his, you know, away from work clothing. And for him, that signals, you know, I'm out of work. Another person sent me a mail saying, I actually walk around the park before I start work, and I walk around the park after I'm done with work. It signals the beginning and the end of my day, much as commute did before. And it allows me to kind of clear my head. So I do think everybody needs to make it unique to them, and also just celebrate the time that you have with your family. I'm fortunate that that Congress isn't in session quite as often. So Susan, I get to spend more time with Susan, which I love. And we're all hanging around here and we talk about what's going on. So make it human for you.
I will actually wrap up with one more question. There are several we won't get to this evening, but I'm going to ask one question of you, and then I'll kick it back to Dean Rajan. You mentioned your dog. There were several little comments about your dog at the back end that there's supposedly a story. There's a story about your dog about they were 60 miles away from home and somehow made their way back. Is that?
That was my sister's dog.
Okay.
And I took the dog on a hike up Mount Si, which is a hike around here. And Sasha is her name, golden retriever. And she was always very skitterish. And she saw a backpacker coming down as we were going up, and she just bolted. And as a result, and I just searched forever for her and never found her. I kept going up day after day, never found her. And this went on for a month. And it was about 60 miles away, but it went on for a month. And then I put signs up, and somebody actually called me and said, I think I have your dog. The dog comes into my yard every evening to get, and I'm now feeding him. And my sister and I went up there, and lo and behold, about 6 o'clock, Sasha pops out of the brush, and there she was, a month to the day. Very, very underweight, but I'm super thankful for it. The thing that you realize is, like, here I took the dog on a hike. My sister wasn't there, and the responsibility you feel that all of a sudden you've lost your sister's dog. And I'm thankful that I got her back. And so somebody must have asked that question who knows me. So whoever it is, hi. And hello to the GSB class of 1990. I'm sad that we didn't get to do our reunion, but I'm hoping we all get together in the future. And the answer to the question, because somebody asked, they didn't ask this question, is white half at Harold's.
So I think we're out of time. So I wanted to thank Kurt for taking the time to come here today, sharing his wisdom, being so candid and thoughtful in his responses. I want to thank all the participants who tuned in and asked such interesting and fundamental questions. So this was wonderful. And again, Kurt, we deeply appreciate everything that you're doing. And we're obviously very proud that you're a Booth alum and you've had amazing successes. Thank you again for taking time to be here today.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for all you're doing for the Booth community. And I hope that everybody stays safe in this challenging time. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kurt. Now, just one last thing. So we will have the next version of our Distinguished Speaker Series on Thursday of next week. And we'll have Tom Ricketts, the owner of the Chicago Cubs, another Booth alum, on at that time. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.